Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our youth-specific track. Our next session explores how the unique neurological development of adolescents influences their competency in legal settings and informs effective restoration practices. These two rock stars up here are both doctors, Dr. Gimel Rogers and Dr. Juliana Caro form fearless individuals resistant to entrapment and igniting live psychology. I am ready for them to bring it. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Caro.
Excellent. There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our lovely presentation. Now, while we do have, first and foremost, there's no financial support or known potential conflict of interest in the delivery of this continuing education presentation. All right, so we have content that we're gonna go over, and we have objectives, and you should have this information already outlined for you. However, I am a professor, so is Dr. Caro, so therefore, we like engagement. If you have a question, because we have 45 minutes to go through an entire presentation that can be broken down into sub-presentations, please do not leave here with any unanswered questions. So if you have a question, even if it's kind of off topic, but it's about youth and adolescents, feel free to raise your hand. All right, before we get started, how many people are probation officers? How many people are judges? How many people are attorneys? How many people are social workers or mental health professionals? Awesome. How many people did not raise their hand, and what is your role? A legal assistant. All right, excellent. Anybody else? Yes. A court clerk. Excellent. Law enforcement. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay. Law enforcement for a school district. Okay, so more like threat assessment, I'm guessing? Okay, excellent. Wonderful. All right. Now, how many people who raise their hands have been in your field for less than 5 years? Okay. All right. So we're gonna hit the foundational aspect, just so you all know, but we're gonna go through the foundation part relatively quickly, just so we can get to the more comprehensive. So DUSKI is the competency standard that was set in 1960. However, when we think about DUSKI, we mostly think about it on the adult side because it's focused on the factual and the rational understanding of the process. Okay, so one thing that we want to highlight, especially for those who have been in the field for a shorter period of time, is that it's not a legal defense. And this is something that we are talking about today because oftentimes with youth, when you engage with youth, you may think that they actually are competent to stand trial, but they're not. In California, we have a youthful offender, which is that 18 to 25 range. And even then, there are some attorneys who say, oh, this person has a juvenile history, so I know they're competent. And then I start to engage with the individual, and I can just tell that they're not competent. And so it's very important that just because you're working with youth or even young adults, that you engage in the competency aspect. And so for adults, which Dr. Caro is going to talk about a little bit more, you have the factual, like do they actually understand who's in the courtroom, what are the procedures? It's almost like rote memory. And if you have somebody who has lower intelligence or lower intellectual functioning, it's easier for them to engage in the factual aspect because it's just almost like robotic. But the rational is the abstract reasoning. It is the ability to really understand and assist the attorney, which is important to conceptualize. So when we look at the history of youth competency, first we need to understand why juvenile courts were even established in the first place. And juvenile courts were established in order to be able to serve and rehabilitate. So not necessarily for punitive measures, but more so for rehabilitation. And so when we think about that, when you have a youth who is even under the age of 15, while the state law doesn't mandate that they have to have a competency hearing, as the attorney, I do encourage you to make sure that you kind of do your own competency screener, and even looking at, are they able to really gauge and understand what is going on in the courtroom, especially when they're facing serious charges. And so a significant amount of changes were made in response to an increasing number of juveniles committing violent crime offenses over the decades. And so that is one of the reasons why in the 90s we saw crime increase, and as we saw crime increase and harsher punishments come about for violent youth offenders, one of the consequences was for policies to change, such as looking at youth competency. All right.
All right, I struggle with the mic even in karaoke, so just let me know if you can't hear me. But getting into the weeds a little bit in terms of youth competency to stand trial, or the factors to consider. CST, competency to stand trial, has become increasingly more important in juvenile courts. And when a juvenile is found incompetent, this may be for various different factors, whether it be mental illness, developmental disability, or even developmental immaturity. And like adults, and what Dr. Rogers had said previously, there are significant differences between, do we have the right slide? Yes, differences between adult and youth competency. Some of this may be whether a youth can be tried in court, right? The level of functioning required for youth to understand illegal proceedings is a bit different. Second, there is more variation in how that dusky standard, that rational and factual, is applied, and this varies across jurisdictions, across different discretionary interpretations, the use of varying assessments. In California, we have something called the JACI, the Juvenile Assessment Inventory, Comprehensive Inventory, which is not applied everywhere in all states, so we see differences there. Also, different factors such as amenability to treatment and their home environment may be more salient in youth as opposed to adult. And finally, for youth offenders, maturity is a huge factor, and a huge factor that may determine whether they're competent to stand trial or not. Also, juvenile mental health courts have been created to provide a diversionary context to evaluate factors with competency. Now, mental health court has been identified as being able to assist with psychiatric, cognitive, behavioral issues, and CST may be one way to get these youth on the radar, but as we'll explore a little bit more later, it is not exactly mental health treatment. Competency to stand trial restoration practices have a very specific scope, and while they may address, it is not usually sometimes the only intervention needed. All right, so factors associated with youth competency to stand trial: mental illness and mental health disorders, right? So mental illness can be difficult to diagnose in youth. What may be appropriate behavior for some age groups may be different for others. And for some age groups may be symptomatic as opposed to perhaps more normative for that age group. Additionally, mental illness has a more substantial impact on an ability to understand court proceedings, to being able to meaningfully participate in proceedings, and help in their own defense. For example, if we think about adults, right, an adult may be experiencing psychosis, but they can still be competent. That may be a little bit different presentation in youth. intellectual disability, and cognitive impairment. So having a low IQ, learning disability, or any other developmental disorder can impact a youth's ability to stand trial. And actually, research has found that youth are found incompetent based on intellectual deficits more often than adults, at a rate of 58% as opposed to 6% in adults. And youth who present with intellectual deficits may have trouble with cognition, such as memory, right? So retaining information, being able to relay it later on, processing the information, making connections or patterns, problem solving, etc. As a result, they may not satisfy the factual and rational understanding prongs of DUSKI, which then can make them incompetent. Another is developmental maturity. What best distinguishes youth competency from adult competency is this concept of developmental maturity. And this encompasses different areas. So we have cognitively, problem solving, ability to understand, decision making, emotion, so self-regulation, being able to withstand the stresses of trial, as well as socially. Right? Are we able, as a youth, able to make healthy connections with those around them, like their attorney, to be able to assist in their defense? And here's a little representation of contextually risk factors for adolescents and their offensive behaviors, potentially.
I just want to add something quickly. For the JACI, how many practitioners have used the JACI? No? Okay. Can somebody tell me, what do you use to assess youth competency? How do you assess youth competency? Or for the attorneys, when you receive reports from mental health professionals, what is typically given? Y'all are making me afraid. What is typically given? What type of evaluation? So the JACI, the Juvenile Adjudicated Competency Interview, is a measure that has been standardized on youth. Different states do use the JACI. I really encourage you all, especially the mental health practitioners, to use the JACI. It's standardized. It has standard questions similar to the RCAI, which is the Adult Adjudication Competency Interview, as well as the FIT, which is also another competency interview for adults. But the reason why I'm talking about the JACI, because in the questions, it's structured, it has an understanding and an appreciation. So it helps break down understanding and appreciation. It also has small vignettes that explores the decision-making and the developmental maturity. So all the aspects that you need to really determine if a youth is competent. So again, JACI, J-A-C-I, Juvenile Adjudicated Competency Interview. Even if you're licensed at the master's level or if you have your master's degree, you should be able to purchase it. I know there's some assessments that are just for doctorate levels, but I believe the JACI can also be purchased for master level practitioners. Also, if you're a practitioner assessing for competency, just in a practical standpoint, looking at using something like the K-BIT, which is the brief intellectual measure, and that is a good screener, or the WASI is also a good screener. The TONI is only for nonverbal measures, but my point is you need to screen for intellectual deficits. The JACI, going back to it, is good for appreciation. So let's say you have a case, hypothetically speaking, you have a case where you think that the youth might be competent, but maybe you want the evaluator to assess for competency to really understand if they can appreciate the wrongfulness of their decisions, because embedded in the JACI they have questions about appreciation and wrongfulness. Are y'all tracking me? And so the JACI is very important as a standard measurement and a tool to use in the cases to see if it can be, to see if the youth is able to stand trial. Also, the K-BIT and the JACI can be given remotely. So I know sometimes places like Texas and even I was doing a training in Ohio, they have rural areas where practitioners may not be able to get to all the time, so they're forced to use Zoom or another platform to do assessments and evaluations. And some practitioners say that there are no mental health assessments that they can give. The JACI is administered orally, the K-BIT is also administered orally, so they don't have to be there in person. So bare minimum, that would be a good screening tools for competency. So just wanted to say that. Oh, it's on me? Okay. Yes.
Also, for the TONI and the K-BIT, these are brief intellectual measures. With the TONI, it's more nonverbal, and the K-BIT has a nonverbal, and the reason I'm taking the mic is for Spanish-speaking youth. That is often given because there is no, unfortunately yet, really verbal assessment of IQ for Spanish-speaking. There are for other languages, as well as there's other cognitive achievement measures that can be given in Spanish, but I just wanted to throw that out there so we don't forget about our Spanish-speaking youth.
Excellent. That's an excellent point. Because some people opt not to give anything, but you can give the nonverbal for non-English speaking populations to at least get a best guess estimate. And therefore, if there is a deficit, then for youth 16 and under, you can give the WISC, and then 16 and over, you can give the WACE, and there's also other nonverbal measures. So the point is making sure you use something standardized, so then that way you can really glean if the youth understands and is tracking you. Okay, time is of the ticking. So, you have my slides, but also if you want a little Psych 101, let me know. We can have a session. Periods of development. What I want to point out here is from 6 to 11 is where themes of development and self-control increases. However, 12 to 25 is where you really start to see that development, although there's new research that indicates the neural pathways are still solidifying up to age 30. That's important because the myelination, not to geek out, is where where information starts to solidify. And so when we think about the middle and late childhood, this is also a time period where these children start to think about peers, so people outside of their family group. Now think that you have a case or a client where their family's dysfunctional, so they're thinking outside of their peer group, so they form informal kinship. Informal kinship is where people outside of their non-blood relatives become like kin. Think of gangs or individuals who may run away and they become trafficked or prostituted. That is why it is important when we look at decision making, how they're easily influenced, especially if they are already in a dysfunctional home because of just regular development. But that's a whole other presentation. So my question for you all today, how does adolescence, meaning brain development, immaturity, acquiescence to authority figures, understanding long-term consequences, etc., impact competency, or how should we think about it in a different way given unique aspects of adolescence? Well, have no fear, that is why I am here, to answer that question for you. Okay. So we'll start off with brain development. So brain development, it is a period, this is the teenage brain, and it goes through like the different aspects and what is happening for the teenage brain. But what I really, and this is typical, this is not substance use, this is not trauma, this is typical teenage brain development. It is important to understand that adolescents are prone to high-risk behaviors because of their brain development. Now, there was a study that was done where they had MRIs of adolescents and adults. And they were shown different facial expressions. The adolescents often identified shock or disappointment or shame or even surprise or fear as anger, whereas adults were able to identify the subtleties in the facial expressions. Now, you may be thinking, why is that important? Well, if you hypothetically have a self-defense case and the child said, no, I really thought they were angry and they were going to attack me, which is why I shot first or hit them first or whatever first, it's because biologically speaking, they cannot recognize the subtleties because they're making decisions from their amygdala versus their prefrontal cortex. Now compound that with somebody who has a lifelong history of trauma. You're with me? Good job. And so now combine that. So you're saying, okay, the trauma brain is already going to be activated from and make decisions from the amygdala. So first of all, because I kind of went ahead, how many people have heard of the amygdala? Yes. Yes. And so next time when I say how many people heard the Jackie, everybody's going to raise their hand. And so we know that the amygdala develops first, and also when the reason why children, adolescents make emotion-based decisions is because they're making it from the amygdala. And so when we want to look at how this relates to competency, let's tie it into some interview or interrogation, depending on your style. So research shows that youth are particularly vulnerable to coercive police interrogation tactics. So youth and adolescents are more likely to comply with adult authority figures and adults. That's why we're talking about competency to stand trial, but even competency to waive rights, that is also important to look at, because research shows that youth who pre-trial in detainment, who are detained pre-trial, are more likely to be transferred, if we're talking about transfer hearings, than youth who are actually out of custody. And so therefore, we need to see, did this person tell on themselves, for lack of better words? Like, were they actually competent to even waive their rights? There are measures out there that practitioners can use, or they can develop their own measures just based on a standard of questions. But if a youth is lower functioning, or if a youth has ADHD and they engage in impulsivity, they may just be like, I'm over this, I'll just tell you what you want to hear. And so that means they weren't even competent to waive their rights. And so we haven't even got to competent to stand trial. Were they even competent to waive their rights? Are y'all tracking me? Okay. So youth are more likely to comply with adult authority figures in the criminal legal context when they don't understand. So if the child feels intimidated or trapped, if there is a risk that the child might answer questions not with the truth, but whatever he or she does, those authority figures want to hear. So meaning that they're just going to acquiesce, they're going to give in, and they're just going to say, yes, sure, I did this, just to kind of escape, if you will, to escape that situation. And so we want to be mindful of getting the information and hearing the youth side of the story as well. Youth are more likely to engage in involuntary and false confessions with prolonged questioning. So more than 80% of interrogations that produce proven false confessions lasted longer than 6 hours. 6 hours. Now, some of you all may be saying, well, you can't really do that for a child, but it's kind of a smoke and mirror, if you will, when it comes to youth and adolescents, because they'll sit you in the room. Do you want a phone call? Do you want some water? Do you want some food? But the whole time they're being observed, and the whole time is considered that interview or interrogation time frame. So it's very important that we look at the whole time and not just the time that they're having a conversation or they're being interviewed. And then also, as it relates to understanding, so competency to waive rights, it is not sufficient if the child merely repeats back the same words. In fact, that may indicate that the child is inappropriately focused on saying things in an effort to please. So even adolescents can engage in childlike behavior and just saying, well, maybe they're just complying to please me or so they can just get out, again, escape from this situation. So it's important to engage in rapport building. So all of my police officers who pick up youth and work with youth, they are children. They may not look like children, maybe because of their stature, but they are still children and adolescents. And so rapport building is key. And we just want to make sure that in the rapport building, we're avoiding any type of coercive tactics. So rapport building, not manipulation. Fine line, but it is a line. All right. So again, only because of time, usually I would, have you all answer these questions, but how do certain mental health diagnoses or the disparities in those diagnoses impact competency? And so when we look at mental health diagnoses, and Dr. Caro is going to get into this in a moment, often youth, especially youth of color, are diagnosed with ODD and C.D. Well, first of all, what is ODD? Good job. What is C.D.? And how many of you all have cases right now where a youth has been diagnosed with either? All right. I'm not going to go on my soapbox because we don't have the time.
We've already done enough soapboxing. So impact of certain mental health diagnoses, and this could encompass psychosis, intellectual disability, trauma. If we're talking about neurodevelopmental disorders, specifically intellectual disability, because neurodevelopmental disorders covers ADHD, intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder. This may impair attention, memory, understanding abstract legal concepts. If it's tough enough for some of us to really get to know what these legal concepts are, imagine as a youth, right? It can make it harder to communicate effectively with others. That is imperative to do so in your case, whether it be your attorney, maybe probation officer. And so with intellectual disability specifically, which means sub-average general intellectual functioning that impairs adaptive functioning in some way. They may struggle to ever attain competency. With psychotic disorders, and when we talk about psychotic disorders, we mean like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, which is a mood and a schizophrenia component. Hallucinations or delusions may distort court roles, understanding of perception, right? The hallmark of these diagnoses is perceptual disturbances, your distortion of reality, inability to really know what's real, what may not be real. And while I'm not going to get into it, but with psychotic disorders, the onset may be later in your 20s. However, a lot of late teens do display symptoms. It's called prodromal. So it's early warning signs, if you will, of these symptoms that may manifest very slowly, bizarre behavior, regression, so to speak, in adaptive functioning, which is leading to a full manifestation of a disorder. And so this may, of course, impair all prongs of competency. With mood disorders, severe symptoms can affect concentration, behavior, participation. With trauma, as Dr. Rogers mentioned, hypervigilance, dissociation, this all disrupts attention, and you're maybe misperceiving intentions or perceiving things as threatening, inability to manage emotions because of this trauma. All of this impacts competency, limits understanding. Going a little bit more on disparities of diagnoses, overdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. Just to reiterate, because this is a point worth emphasizing, youth of color are more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, being labeled as troublemakers, as problematic, right? Which, while we may be aware of it or not, shifts of perceptions from treatable to criminal. Girls may be internalizing disorders more, so it's overlooked as opposed to maybe externalizing behaviors that boys are engaging in. Underdiagnoses. I'm sure people have encountered youth who are seniors in high school, and you're like, what? How is this possible? Very low reading levels, low IQ, and it's also not going into an attention on that front, but underdiagnosis and not being able to be given appropriate supports. and systematic consequences. Misdiagnosis can affect access to appropriate treatment, to resources, and then they're left untreated, mistreated, and underdiagnosed. Do we have a question? Yes.
I do, which is, I'm Tyra McCollum. I'm a judge here in Fort Bend County. My question is, as it relates to any of these diagnoses, how should we contextualize it if it has that language in front of it that says provisional? What is the significance of a provisional diagnosis versus one that says, no, this is the diagnosis?
We love the question. So with provisional diagnoses, or you may see diagnostic impressions, for example, with youth, it's difficult to diagnose, and sometimes these behaviors may look like symptoms of disorders. Or, some disorders may apply right now and may not apply in the future. So in order to be able to give caution of this person needs more diagnostic clarity. This person is showing symptoms of this disorder, but at this time, provisionally, we're going to give this for treatment purposes. However, this may not be the end result, so to speak, because these presentations do vary in youth. And Dr. Rogers?
Yeah, I was going to say, if those are maybes, then
So here,
they're just maybes.
so I got you, right? Okay, so this is a question that I would encourage you to ask. What symptoms qualified this person for the provisional diagnosis? Then I would say, okay, what symptoms, or after they list the symptoms, let's say they say anhedonia, right, which is lack of interest in pleasurable activities. And they say, well, anhedonia, then you can say, does anhedonia, is anhedonia a symptom in any other disorder? And if they're competent, they should say yes, because anhedonia is found in depression as well as schizophrenia and some other disorders. Then you can say, well, did you consider those disorders? Because I don't see it written down in your report that you also consider these disorders. And how is this disorder different from this disorder? And so the reason why I encourage you to go down that line of questioning is because, one, especially going back to misdiagnosing with conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder, they can say, well, the person is acting out. And you can say, well, Dr. So-and-so, isn't it true that young children who experience trauma also act out? And so how are you classifying this behavior under this particular disorder? Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's where we see it, the provisional, the most under the ODDs and under this, yeah.
Exactly, and so that's why I would get into the nitty-gritty and just say, tell me what symptoms qualified the individual for that disorder. Do these symptoms occur in any other disorders? Did you consider any of these other disorders? Why or why not? And what cultural factors did you take into context as you gave this person a provisional diagnosis? Because the issue is, you have some providers who then just start to say, oh, even though it's provisional, I'm going to take this diagnosis. Whereas myself, I challenge all the diagnoses because I know that a person may have been given a provisional diagnosis. It has been adopted through the years, but nobody actually did the due diligence to see if they met that diagnosis. And I see it a lot on the adult side with antisocial personality disorder, where they never even met the criteria prior to the age of 15. And criteria C says you had to meet conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. So I would just try to glean an understanding of what symptoms and the behaviors or the thoughts, meaning their reported information that they gave you that then qualified them for that. Okay. Sorry, I teach psychopathology, so we could talk about the DSM all day long.
I also just want to add, these evaluations, if they don't, they should, have limitations, right? We have the information that's presented. Sometimes we don't have any records. Sometimes we have only self-report. What does the collateral say? What does the testing say? What does the record say? Also, I do want to emphasize that point of, I've worked in many hospitals, and you see clients with 25 diagnoses in front of me because that diagnosis will follow this individual for their life. And it's very important to be able to qualify these diagnoses, and if it's provisional or diagnostic impression, until you have all the evaluation, resources, then that's something to be considered. Anyway, okay, competency implications. Diagnosis shape whether a youth can learn, how they retain core information, disparities in diagnoses, influence what services they receive. Do they need educational supports? Do they need psychiatric medication? Do they need behavioral? Also, in terms of psychiatric medication, a lot of our youth are overdiagnosed and over-medicated. So again, I'm not going to go on that soapbox either. Courts risk violating this due process rights if we're not considering these competency deficits that may result from undiagnosis or misdiagnoses. And for restoration, it should be noted that fitness to proceed and restoration processes, as I said before, may not cover all possible causes of a child's incompetence, such as a developmental disability or lack of chronological maturity. Fitness is not the ideal pathway into behavioral health treatment, but it may be one. Okay, time is just flying. How does trauma impact competency? You can reflect while we look at this. So really quickly, because this can be a presentation on its own. So the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, have we heard of this? Yes. Great. So trauma extends just beyond the psychological effects it has for a youth and adult, right? Biologically, trauma affects the brain significantly. I'm not going to go into many of the nuances, but functionally, neurochemically, in specific brain areas, that leads to behaviors that you're seeing. That leads to some of these reasons why they may be incompetent. Also, it affects the amygdala, we all have heard about. So really quickly, be mindful of our own biases. A word I want to say on this, nowadays, I feel like the word trauma is just thrown around, and really the meaning behind it has maybe left the building, so to speak. It is devaluing what trauma really represents and the experience that results from a disturbing event that could be nature-related, caused by another human. It's the same with the word trigger, right? This is all thrown around, but this is a very important life experiences that have disturbed development and can be affecting competency. So this is a bit more of the same, but we cannot go through too much on it, but just ACEs does affect the outcome. It doesn't just affect the youth, it affects long-term into adulthood. And many individuals in the legal system have many ACEs. Oh, recommendations and factors to consider, because we're running out of time. Oh, we're not running out of time that much. Okay, so how does brain development, the period of adolescence, mental health diagnosis, and trauma impact restoration practices? Pal, maybe we'll get one answer on this. Yeah, go ahead. Of all the information we've laid out, whether it be your experience or just thinking about what we've talked about, how does brain development, the period of adolescence, mental health diagnosis, and trauma impact restoration? The ability to process to participate in legal proceedings. Right, yeah. So all these biological processes, emotional processes that are affecting their ability to sit in court and maybe behave appropriately, understand what's going on. So adolescent brain development, we talked about prefrontal cortex, but this is responsible for judgment, impulse control, abstract reasoning, all important concepts for competency. Heightened limbic activity, right? Stronger emotional reactivity, reward-seeking behaviors, which can overshadow rational decision-making. Think about your own time as an adolescent. Limited metacognition, they're still developing the ability to think about their own thinking, to reflect, to think about the needs of others and consequences, right? I prefer short term versus what may happen in the future. It might not even be a thought. Vulnerability to stress and suggestibility. Adolescents are more likely to comply with authority, as we've talked about, and become overwhelmed under stress. Long-term limits. Some adolescents may not achieve competence into older adolescence or adulthood. Well, even in adulthood, they may not. And these are because of certain cognitive capacities. Legally and ethically, courts must balance due process rights with recognition that development and maturity isn't a defect to be restored, but a normal stage of growth. It also means adolescent brain development, that restoration practices must be educational, concrete, and developmentally sensitive. And some youth may never reach competency until their brain matures further, which I know courts use 25 as that kind of golden age, but there is a lot of research out there that may extend into 30. Maybe more. Who knows? So this raises ethical question about fairness and prolonged detention. So in terms of restoration practices that you all navigate in decision-making out here, I did take a look at the juvenile bench book. It's some light reading. And so I saw that if youth do not meet criteria or they're just found unfit, they meet criteria for inpatient mental health services or residential, they're placed with Health and Human Services Commission, a state hospital, private psychiatric inpatient or outpatient. What seems to be the trends here in terms of restoration practices for youth? Is it more inpatient-based, outpatient-based? Least restrictive.
Who were you saying? Oh, you. Outpatient. Inpatient. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm going to take the last 5 minutes. It seems that they don't have the most updated PowerPoint, but that's okay because we only had one slide left. And overall, recommendations and factors to consider. Number one, define competence. Number one, define competence. Number two, due process considerations. Number two, due process considerations. And number three, competency evaluations by qualified mental health professionals. So qualified mental health professionals. So when we talk about defining competence, youth competency should be taken into consideration differently. I'm not sure how it works out here, but many states have rotations for attorneys, meaning that they don't always get to elect to work in the juvenile system and they have their place in the juvenile system. Do you all work that way too, where it's rotation or you get to choose? Oh, that's awesome. So if you're choosing to work with youth, I encourage you to understand, one, developmental psychology, because it'll give you a foundational one-on-one on decision-making, similar to what we talked about earlier today. Also, it's important to understand developmental maturity at certain age and milestones, and if it's actually mature behavior for that age and milestone, the potential mental illness and or cognitive deficits that it may impact on their developmental maturity. Youth have a right to counsel before and during the evaluation. So competency evaluations in juvenile court can be significant and have lasting impact on the youth, such as loss of liberty or freedom. So having counsel is crucial, even going back to, were they competent to waive their rights? Very, very important. And because youth should be protected against any self-incriminating statements. And youth competency evaluation should be performed by individuals with training in psychology or psychiatry and with a focus in forensics. So when you get the evaluation, it is important to have a conversation if you're able, or subpoena the mental health practitioner and ask them in court, what tools or measures did you use? Are they validated on youth? Tell me a little bit more about your process. How did you come to the conclusion that they are competent, especially if you, as the attorney who's representing the youth, do not feel that the youth is competent to stand trial? So overall, As we close in these last 2 minutes, here's some references. If you have any questions or you want to follow up, this is our information. Dr. Caro and myself are both licensed psychologists and can consult or evaluate, but also most importantly, the main takeaways of today is that youth have different standards of competence than adults. Developmental factors play a role. Misdiagnosing does occur, and that also plays a role in competency. Ensuring that you understand how trauma plays a role. One aspect that we did not talk about was substance use, and also how substance use plays a role in brain development. So all of these environmental factors play a role. And I know that we sped through the 2 brain slides. One brain slide was showing an abused brain. The other brain slide was showing neglect, more environmental factors. I bring up both of those brain slides because it shows whether there is actual abuse or there's neglect, it affects the brain and its development, and it affects the temporal lobes. And when you think of temporal lobes, think of temper. And so what you saw on the slide, the dark areas mean that they're lying dormant. You want to see a lot of green and red. That means there's a lot of activity. And when it's lying dormant, that means that person's temporal lobes is not working. It's not inhibiting the behaviors. It's not inhibiting the temperament of the individual. And so therefore, it's not firing. Now, can we use MRIs on every single child, adolescent, and adults? No, we cannot, which is why we lean on the research. Now, there's some prosecutors who want to say, oh, Dr. Rogers, you didn't give this person an MRI. I did not. However, the factors remain. There's substantial research that remains, and there's other slides that you can use in the courtroom to show, because some people are visual learners, that there has been an adverse impact even due to environmental influences, because some people want to minimize psychological abuse and psychological torture and say, well, they were never physically or sexually abused, but neglect and even gaslighting produces the same effects. Thank you so much.